It's been really wonderful to come back to Birmingham. I haven't been here for the last 4 or 5 years since I finished my research, the research that the book is based on. So it feels very good and right to make this my first stop now that the book is out, and to be part of a local conversation about history. So thank you so much for having me, and thank you all for coming out tonight. And I hope you find the talk stimulating and worthwhile. And I'm looking forward to questions after. And I've noticed I have the wrong title on the first slide. It should be the Galtons of Birmingham. I really wanted to call out a shout out to Birmingham in this talk. And the biggest gun-making firm in the 18th century in Birmingham and in Britain and possibly in the world too was owned by a Quaker family here in Birmingham, the Galton family. And they were the biggest suppliers of guns to the slave trade in West Africa. They were major suppliers of guns to the East India Company for use in the conquest of South Asia, and they also supplied guns for conquest and trade in North America. But they were also the biggest suppliers of guns to the British government in its almost non-stop wars against Spain and then France in the period 1688 to 1815, sort of the long 18th century. Now, the Quaker sect was founded in the midst of the religiously framed political wars of the 17th century, and most of us will know that a core principle of the Quaker faith is belief in the unchristian nature of war. Quakers do not participate in war or in war training. And they were a persecuted minority for long because they refused to swear loyalty to the king or to arm themselves in the defense of his realm in a time that really was quite rife with dynastic conflict and conspiracy against the regime, both at home and abroad. So how do we explain the Galtons? And why did Quakers tolerate them as Quakers, given their livelihood, the source of their livelihood? The family began working in the gun trade from about 1702, and they were prominent in the Birmingham Quaker meeting for generations without attracting any critical notice for their family business for almost a century. And then suddenly, in 1795, the Birmingham Society of Friends threatened to disown Samuel Galton II, Samuel Galton Junior, unless he left the arms trade. And let me just situate you here. This is a portrait you may have seen of Samuel Galton II, there are 3 Samuel Galtons. He's the middle one, who's the focus of what I'm going to talk about. And it's funny, I have this slide for other talks when people don't know where Birmingham is. So we can just skip this one. I'll just keep it on Galton. I'm going to remember that. That was good. So what happened in 1795? Why did the Quaker community suddenly realize this contradiction in Galton's life as an arms-making Quaker? Why was it not a problem for so long, and then why does it suddenly become a problem in 1795? Did guns suddenly change? Did Quakerism suddenly change? And what was the result of this controversy? Was Galton actually disowned? So these are the questions that I set out to answer in writing this book, and they're the questions I'm going to try and answer for you today. And I think, just to anticipate where we'll end, the answers reveal how difficult it was and how difficult it still is to extricate oneself entirely from participating in warfare, regardless of principles and beliefs. War was and remains integral to industrial capitalist society. So in short, our challenge today is to make sense of this phrase, of this idea of a Quaker gunmaker. For this phrase to make sense, either our understanding of the word Quaker needs to change, or our understanding of gun needs to change, or our understanding of making needs to change. And then it will no longer be a paradox. So let's start with guns. Don't worry about the hyphen. There's always some smart person who says, what about the hyphen? Okay, let's start with guns. What did Galton think he was making when he was making guns? So the first thing to keep in mind is that 18th century guns worked very differently from guns today. They were perishable and they were unreliable. And let me just show you a couple of images. This is a pistol made by Joseph Farmer, who was the first Samuel Galton's father-in-law. Okay, so this is an early 18th century weapon. And then this is the most commonly produced, the standard military arm of the 18th century all the way up to the 1830s, the Brown Bess, that enabled the British to conquer so much of the world. And the Galtons made a lot of these, and a lot of parts for these. Okay, so just to give you a visual of the objects we're talking about. So 18th century guns, how were they used in general in this period? So I'm happy to talk about the sources I used to arrive at these conclusions, but after examining records of gun use in this period in Britain, what I found was that guns were not used in crimes of passion. In this time and place, most murders took place in heated arguments or brawling circumstances. So this is sort of a cartoon that gives you a sense of, how people will reach for whatever is near at hand, right? Whatever instrument is near at hand. An everyday blunt instrument, a stick. You can see the canes flying around there, the candlestick in the back. Violence was intimate if it was emotionally motivated. It often involved, blunt instruments or strangling or beating with the hands and feet. Guns were also not used by rioters in the 18th century. And the interesting thing is that guns are not very readily available to most people in the first half of the century. They are somewhat more available in the second half of the century, and yet you don't see a change in these trends. They're still not used by rioters. They're still not used in crimes of passion. So there's something cultural going on there. It's not just about availability. So guns were used in conflicts around property at home and abroad. And the 18th century was the period of the rise of private property in England. And guns were really essential to that process. So you see them, used in smuggling, robbery, poaching, and then protecting property against smugglers, poachers, burglars. And in such scenarios, they were instruments of intimidation, right? And here's a caricature of a highway robbery. And so they were, as instruments of intimidation, they were paradoxically understood as part of the civilizing process, part of an emerging culture of politeness. They're a polite counter to the more intimately threatening instruments of violence that others out there might use, tomahawks or swords. Therefore, violence between people who don't know one another, violence between strangers, that's impersonal, and therefore polite, because it's violence that can be threatened and perpetrated from a distance, and that allows it to be impersonal in a way that using a blunt instrument would not be. And they could be used this way because they were so unreliable, right? So this, if I could just posit the thought process of an 18th century individual thinking about using a gun, what they might be thinking would go something like this. Now, I'm pulling a trigger that will unleash a multi-step mechanical process that may or may not result in harm to you, right? I don't know what's going to happen. And the multiple steps in that process produce a distance between my intention, which is simply to protect my property, and the result, which could be anything from nothing at all, or just completely terrifying you, or wounding you, or actually killing you. There was a small chance of that too. So the outcome is then the result of an impersonal mechanical process, right? And all this meant that a firearm was not a very satisfactory weapon to reach for in a passionate act. But it was pretty effective to wave around in intimidation like a loose cannon to stave off conflict, because you don't know what's going to happen. So guns were for waving in the face of strangers, highwaymen, trespassers. They're an impersonal deterrent. So Adam Smith, the famous political economic thinker of this time, wrote about this aspect of firearms in The Wealth of Nations, and he said that he was confident that although it does at first sight appear to be so pernicious, the invention of firearms in fact favored both, quote, the permanency and extension of civilization. And let me just show you a picture that I think kind of illustrates this. This is an advertisement from a gun maker in Bristol. And what it says down at the bottom, I hope it's clear there, is merchants supplied with guns and stores for the African, West India, and Newfoundland trade as cheap as at any warehouse in England. And then you see, the civilizing kind of properties of the gun that's clutched, by the European gentleman on that side, and then by the native who's been civilized by the fact that he's been provided with this gun, and then there's the ship in the back, symbol of commerce and civilization being spread. So in short, guns were not merely more efficient substitutes for knives or swords. They're serving new kinds of violent purposes and making new kinds of violence related to property possible in the 18th century. And I should say here that even in warfare, they're being used as a terrorizing deterrent. Muskets, like the Brown Bess, did kill, obviously, in war, but the rate of fire was more important than accuracy. They were not aimed in the 18th century. So soldiers would load their guns and then fire in unison. And again, Adam Smith recognized this, and he also wrote that firearms had revolutionized warfare with the noise and smoke they produced, and with, quote, the invisible death to which every man feels himself every moment exposed. So that's terror, right? That's how they worked. They're an instrument of terror. So it's not about marksmanship. Firing would strike the enemy at random, and it was the bayonet charge close up that typically decided the outcome in 18th century battles. And these military uses were, of course, also bound up with the question of property on a national scale. The French threat that the British encounter was understood as a threat to the nation and the regime of property that had been introduced from 1689. Guns were also a currency. They're used in trade around the world to open up markets and as a currency that you could use to pay for other goods, as well as a commodity of trade itself. They were literally money in some instances. They're valued at home and abroad for their intrinsic metal content and their symbolic value, quite apart from what they could do, right, as weapons. So they were objects of trade and facilitators of trade. All this meant that a Quaker in the 18th century could own guns without raising any eyebrows for most of the 18th century. And Quakers did own guns for hunting and agricultural purposes like shooting vermin on their lands. So in 1776, an American Quaker came to visit the Galtons in their home right outside Birmingham. And he described Galton's life and the lands around this home with unadulterated admiration, including in that admiration for the very capital manufactory of muskets. So there was nothing strange about this, even in 1776, in the eyes of this American Quaker. So in sum, guns were a weapon for a new kind of society made up of greater numbers of strangers and determined to defend property as a point of national pride. In this particular moment, they were not the weapon of the angry and the passionate or the weapon of the mob. They were the weapon a man of property might legally use to fend off an angry mob, or the weapon a highwayman might illegally use to snatch that property. But all of this was changing in the 1790s when the scandal erupted around the Galtons. Up to the 1790s, a Quaker gunmaker could reasonably tell himself that he was making an object that promoted civilization and a more polite form of violence. But then guns started to earn a new reputation in British society during the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars at the end of the century, from 1793 to 1815. This was a period of mass arming on an unprecedented scale and really long exposure to firearms amongst ordinary Britons. And this is when the British shift to effective aimed fire in battle begins. aiming becomes a new and particularly British practice. Guns made the mass casualties of those wars possible, not because of their technological superiority to pikes or swords, but because of the impersonality with which they allowed impromptu soldiers, volunteer soldiers, to dispense death. Right? These are not trained warriors. These are just ordinary people who have to shoot, who have to kill someone, and it's easier to do that with this impersonal weapon than up close. So an entire generation was now shaped by mass warfare, free from dependence on any individual emotional investment. In this new context, guns found uses in new kinds of interpersonal violence that was unrelated to property and not seen as civilizing. So guns now began to appear in reports of new kinds of untimely death. For instance, in 1802 in Gloucester, there's news of a 15-year-old discharged soldier waving his musket at people, threatening to fire and intimidating them. And then he gets up on Bristol Bridge, and without giving any warning, the paper reported, he wantonly drew the trigger and killed a man. Right? This was a very new type of report about gun violence. So these wars produced a generation capable of a new kind of impersonal and casual violence with guns that was unrelated to property and also still unrelated to passion. Right? But before this shift in the 1790s, the gun in Quaker gunmaker was more complicated than we might have thought. Okay, so that's part one. Now we go to part two, the word maker. Did Galton actually think he made guns? So Galton actually made a lot of things. He made guns, but he also made swords and bayonets and knives and forks and cutlasses and harpoons and lances and gravers and lots of metal goods. And gun makers in general were often also known as toy makers. They also made other toys like buckles, rings, gilt rings of various sorts, bells for various purposes, buttons, curry combs. So I'm sure you all know this figure here, Matthew Boulton. He's the illustrious toy maker of Birmingham, and he produced everything from steam engines to coins to buttons. And in a similar way, Galton is a similar type of industrialist, in that he's making guns, but also buckles and nails, and selling them to customers everywhere. So Galton also made iron. He was a big investor in the canals that you have around Birmingham that have recently been, I think, renovated, or there's more access to them now, I understand. He engaged in various kinds of global trade, and he later ran a bank, and I'll tell you more about that later. So that's Galton. And gun making in general was a very highly divided industry. So Galton was assembling parts for guns that were made by a whole range of specialists known by their the processes that they specialized in. So there were filers, there were stock makers, welders, borers, grinders, polishers, engravers, and so on and on. So Galton felt that his contribution to the manufacture of guns was merely incremental. Moreover, those other specialists, the polishers and welders and engravers and so on, were also applying their skills to other goods, not just guns, right? So how do we say then, looking back, who made guns and who did not make guns? Gun makers like the Galtons were also drawing a lot of other people into investment in their gun business. So Galton's brass suppliers, because there's brass furniture on a lot of these guns. So he's buying brass from these suppliers. But those suppliers are also buying guns from him, and they're using them in the African trade and the Atlantic trade. And at a point, he also had drawn major Manchester textile dealers into his business as his creditors as well, and even commission agents. So a lot of people were invested in making guns. And the British state, particularly we're talking about the Office of Ordnance, really worked to keep the gun industry and gun-making skills diffuse on purpose because of political concerns that emerged after the Revolution of 1689. which led to the establishment of the constitutional monarchy under William and Mary. And these are, again, things that I need to say to American audiences that I may not need to remind you of. But in any case, no one knows what 1689 is back home. But the government was worried basically about Jacobite rebels, right? People who would overturn the new monarchy and restore the ousted Stuarts who had fled to the continent. And the fear was that an overly concentrated gun-making industry might more easily be captured by rebels, right? And so the object was to ensure that there were multiple centers of gun production in the country to avoid that risk. So Birmingham was made, sort of encouraged, the gun industry here was sort of nurtured by the Office of Ordnance from the beginning. And it and London were both important centers of gun making, but they also depended on expertise and materials coming from other places, from Bristol, from Liverpool, from the villages surrounding Birmingham. They got wood from Gloucester for the stocks for the guns. So there are wide networks involved here. And to keep this widespread talent healthy and prosperous, the government was supporting gun making even in peacetime. I'll give you some examples of the ways that it did that. One way was that the Office of Ordnance would issue contracts for guns even in peacetime, which was not too difficult given that even in so-called peacetime, there usually was some kind of conflict going on at the margins of this ever-expanding empire. Another thing it did was it would employ out-of-work gun-making artisans in government armory shops in the Tower of London. And they would also sell old military muskets from the Tower back to the gun-making trade so that they could sell those on in Africa, these second-hand guns, basically. They would sell them in Africa and in other markets around the world just to keep them in business during peacetime. The government also allowed private gun manufacturers to use government proofing facilities. The proof is what ensures the safety of the barrel, and a proof-marked gun was considered safer and better quality to be sold in any market, right? So when there were struggling up-and-coming gun makers in London who said that they couldn't afford the proof charges in the private proof house that they had access to, the government said, that's fine, you can use the King's proof house, so that, and this was all in the interest of keeping that industry populous and diffuse and not very, very concentrated. And the concern here by the state is to ensure that individual gun makers don't get too much power by currying favor with the state, because they don't want any small set of guns or small set of gun makers or individual gun maker to have too much access to or too much control of the kingdom's arms. So they're not trying to create a military-industrial complex, which is something very concentrated. They're trying to create something much more diffuse than that. So the Ordnance Office, which is the main office interacting with gun makers, the staff there were warned not to, quote, give any favorite artificers as much work as they please, though the office may have no occasion for their service, right? So they're warning against that kind of corruption. Instead, the government made possible the expansion of annual production of guns from tens of thousands at the start of the century to millions by the end of the century by drawing greater and greater numbers of workers into this task of arms production. So this shift in the magnitude of production from tens of thousands to millions was not the result of the introduction of machinery into the process, but of expansion of the number of people involved in gun making and many small adaptations of industrial organization in the gun industry. So during the Napoleonic Wars, at the end of this period, even Birmingham's carpenters and cabinet makers were helping make guns by rough stocking them. And the Office of Ordnance was providing funds to train lock makers. The lock makers were the most skilled workers in the manufacture of guns. The locks are the most difficult part of the gun to make. And so the state is providing funds to train more of them so that more people could do it and there wouldn't be a bottleneck in lockmaking. And they also choose a musket design that's simple enough to mass produce by more workers by copying the design that's used by the East India Company. And the East India Company is, of course, part of the state and has kind of a complicated relationship to it, which we can talk more about later. The Office of Ordnance is also employing inspectors to check on the uniformity of parts to ease mass production of guns. It's also forcing gun makers at times to manufacture their arms in collective factory-style warehouses rather in their separate workshops to create some efficiencies of scale. So factory organization grows out of this government-led effort to increase productivity well before the era of machine production that began in the mid-19th century. And the state, of course, also builds its own factory to expand gun making even further and to, again, deny any group of gun makers too much political power. And that was eventually the factory at Enfield that opens up in the early 19th century. Now, beyond gun making, everyone that Galton knew, including most of the people in his Quaker networks, was making something used by the state for some kind of war-related purpose. So if they weren't making guns, they were supplying iron that was used in the making of guns and other military material, war material. Or they were supplying finance, or they're supplying copper. So these are, if you think of Quakers in particular, the Lloyd family, the Hanburys, the Plumsteads. These are families that the Galtons were tied to by marriage and by business. More generally, the West Midlands industrial economy was built up significantly by war-related contracting. You had thousands of skilled artisans manipulating metal into everything from buttons to pistol springs for the king's men. Other industries were filling demand, war demand for things like copper sheets, rivets, nails, paper, wheelbarrows, rope, oars, canvas, chain, bar iron, pencils, textiles for uniforms, and much, much more. And not to mention food, bedding, barracks, medicines, specie to pay the soldiers, and so on and so on and so on. And this whole network of industrialists providing all these materials supported one another on government work. So gun makers helped Matthew Boulton with his copper contracts for the government, and Boulton in turn secured gun contracts for them, often through his people he knew, or even with the East India Company. So Galton's whole business and family network was involved in war-related contracting or finance. And the end of the Napoleonic Wars in 1815 really brought ruin to the Midlands iron industry, where half of the blast furnaces in the area were shut down pretty soon after. So in short, government gun purchases were the tip of an iceberg. The state was a bulk purchaser that brought the bounty of mass demand that made industrial trades worth the enormous risk they entailed, and that made mass production of objects both necessary and possible. So this word maker is more complicated than it seems. Everyone was a gun maker in some fashion, and gun makers were much more than just gun makers. They were not only gun makers. So now let's take that last word, Quaker. So Quakers were not supposed to be involved in war. And they evolved mechanisms for self-policing to ensure that everyone is following this principle in the 18th century. And you really start to see this happening in 1742, during the War of the Austrian Succession. At that point, the central yearly meeting of the sect in London begins to check in with local groups with an explicit query about whether friends were participating in warlike activities. And this query was suddenly necessary in 1742 because it was becoming increasingly evident that a lot of Quakers were becoming quite invested in the war economy of that time. Many of them had by then become established as successful bankers or traders or industrialists who had prospered thanks to the wars. And the state itself was actively tapping these Quaker networks. It was drawn to those networks just like other merchants and traders and customers were, because of their collective reputation for honesty and reliability. So the opportunity to profit from war was very great by the 1740s, and many Quakers were profiting, and so it suddenly becomes a concern, and there's more policing of this. Now, Quakers were straying from principle, not only because they were greedy for profit, but also because of a genuine sense of patriotism. Some participated in the suppression of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745 by giving gifts to soldiers or even bearing arms. Galton II's uncle, Joseph Farmer II, don't worry, it's another member of the family. He invoked patriotism to explain why he joined the forces that put down that rebellion. Then he remained a soldier in the 7 Years' War, and he didn't seem to feel this was a contradiction with the fact that he was part of a Quaker family. In 1748, to give you another example, Dr. John Fothergill in London said he welcomed the end of the War of the Austrian Succession. He was welcoming peace as a Quaker, but, quote, as an Englishman, he hoped that war would be pursued with vigor until a solid peace was secured. So these conflicting commitments, right? So the community had become invested enough in the regime that the hold of those Quaker principles had loosened. And during the 7 Years' War, it was even harder for socially established Quakers to stand aloof from war, as war was becoming obviously the central and defining fact of 18th century British life and national identity. So financial stalwarts like the Barclays were critical to the government's ability to fight these wars in the latter half of the century. Now, in 1776, Thomas Paine, who was the son of an English Quaker, pointed his finger at Quaker hypocrisy at the end of Common Sense. And he noted the, quote, "The general tenor of your actions wants uniformity." He refused to credit the pretended scruples of Quakers because, he said, "we see them made by the same men who in the very instant that they are exclaiming against the mammon of this world are nevertheless hunting after it with a step as steady as time and an appetite as keen as death." So quite an indictment in 1776. So the sect is increasing its self-policing, right? He's speaking almost as one of that community, right? But still, no one is saying anything about Galton in 1776. And the Galton family business. And that could be, I think, partly because guns themselves still have not acquired a very scandalous reputation in the 1770s. Perhaps war finance may have looked worse at that point than gun making. How does that start to change? Well, the British have one defeat in the 18th century, which is the defeat against the Americans in 1783. And that defeat really kind of raised the moral stakes for Britain on the global stage. And the slave trade in particular began to look like a moral liability for the nation. And Quakers, of course, became critical to the launch of the movement to abolish the slave trade in the years that followed the end of that war. And the role of guns in the slave trade and in the summary punishments that were used on slave plantations became part of the critique of the slave trade. So earlier, the Quaker sect's emphasis had always been on sort of staying separate and pure itself, whatever the rest of society was doing, right? They're not trying to reform anyone else. But now there's a sort of moment where you see the sect break with that tradition and take up a political crusade on behalf of the entire nation, right? So Galton's kinsman was David Barclay, and he was a leader of this movement to abolish the slave trade. And abolition was also partly about kind of reviving the sect as discipline was withering within it, right? It's an opportunity to strengthen commitment within it. And it's also part of this wider British search for redemption after defeat against the American colonies in 1783. So the stakes are really high. And with such stakes, ethical consistency on the national stage became critical to the Quakers in a new way. So the central meeting group, the yearly meeting group in London, now starts to assert its influence on those regional branches much more, and deliberately tries to impose greater conformity. So an epistle of 1790 goes out to those local meetings, which reads like this: "We have been publicly charged with some under our name fabricating or selling instruments of war." And the epistle calls for an inquiry into this accusation so that anyone found to be involved with a practice so inconsistent might be reclaimed, and failing that, disowned. So this is the first allusion to arms making as a particular problem. So finally, at this point, a Quaker in Birmingham complains about the Galtons. And they complain because of the Galton family's role in the slave trade, providing guns that are used in the slave trade. And this Quaker says we should not accept his donation to enlarge the Bull Street meeting house. But still, nothing sort of formal transpires to do anything with the Galtons for a couple more years. And then in 1795, the Birmingham meeting finally objects to the military purposes that Galton's guns are used for. And then they take up this matter of asking him to leave that business or be disowned by the sect. And Galton was painfully aware that many of his accusers were as invested in war as he was. You can see that. So note the timing here. This is just when guns are also beginning to earn a new reputation as instruments of wanton violence, mid-1790s. And right in 1795, in fact, the Society of Friends also explicitly proclaims itself against hunting and shooting, the pastimes that require guns. So guns became scandalous in a new way at precisely the moment at which Quakers become much more concerned about scandal. They really want to avoid that. So 1795 becomes the year of reckoning for Galton. And here we see then that this word Quaker is complicated too. Quakers were not always Quakers. They were also sometimes Britain's first, right, in the 18th century. So in the end, once we understand the 18th century culture of violence and patriotism, the political context of that Jacobite threat, and the complicated modes of manufacture at stake here, there is not so much of a paradox in this phrase, Quaker gun maker. So now let's look at what Galton did in this face of this threat of disownment, when new understandings of guns and when Quaker obligations suddenly made this idea of a Quaker gun maker appear paradoxical. So he was a very self-consciously modern man. Besides being a gun maker, he was also a scientist. He was a fellow of the Royal Society, like his friends Matthew Boulton and James Watt. He was a member of Birmingham's Lunar Society, and he refused to simply comply with the wish that he abandon his gun trade, and instead he decided to publicly defend himself and defend his position. So he printed and circulated, in early 1796, he prints and circulates this defense in the form of a letter to the Birmingham meeting. And I think the fact that he printed and circulated this means that he had a great deal of confidence in what he was saying. This was not just a flimsy rationalization. He was really in earnest, whatever we may look back and think of it, right? He really intended later generations to consider his arguments seriously for the light that they could shed on the real life limits to living a life disconnected from war in his time. So his first main argument was that everyone, including his fellow Quakers, participated in war almost ineluctably, and that his own role was merely incremental. And there was some truth in this, as we have seen. He also argued that the production of commodities prone to abuse is so complex that it's actually impossible to assign moral responsibility for them. So as it says, it's hard to read this, but I'll read you one of the quotes on this page. He asks, "Is the farmer who sows barley, the brewer who makes it into beverage, the merchant who imports rum, or the distiller who makes spirits, responsible for the intemperance, the disease, the vice, and misery which may ensue from their abuse?" So he perceived economic actors so interdependent and so tied to the state that they collectively formed a kind of military-industrial society. The extreme division of labor, with each gun passing through hundreds of highly skilled hands before it's complete, and the intermittent nature of manufacturers' relationship with the state made it difficult for him to concede any particular responsibility for participating in war, or particular complicity in war. As far as he could see, everyone who was anyone in Midland industrial society was in some way complicit in the production of war material or financing of war. So Samson Lloyd of the Lloyd family was one of the friends appointed to sort of visit him as part of this reclamation process. And he was the scion of a family that had long supplied iron for the Galton gun manufacturing. So, looking at this, from Galton's point of view, the gun was a really collectively, even socially produced object. And why was Lloyd off the hook and he not, right? So one lesson here is to think about the Industrial Revolution differently, to think about the extent to which it depended on war and on government demand for war material. Galton lamented to his judges in this document, "The practice of your principles is not compatible with the situation in which Providence has placed us." So he saw himself as part of a wider military-industrial society in which there was little, if any, political economic space outside the war machine. The other main strand of Galton's defense was that guns were not instruments of violence, but tools of civilization, like doorknobs and hinges, protecting property, right? So he invoked the 18th century understanding of guns as deterrents to more horrific and unruly forms of violence, and as instruments for the entirely justified purpose of defending property. And we know that up to that moment in which he was writing, this was how guns were generally understood in Britain. But that view was just beginning to look out of date at that point. And Quakers in particular had already begun to see guns as unequivocally violent, just instruments of violence. So Galton's argument was an early articulation of the way that the division of labor that characterizes modern forms of industrial production tends to alienate the manufacturer from his product and release him or her from any sense of responsibility for what that product is going to be used for, right? Or what it even is. And it's this alienation that made possible the mass production necessary for the mass violence of modern warfare. So paradoxically, at the very moment in which lethal mechanical violence came to pervade modern existence, it became invisible to those responsible for its spread. Galton argued that by singling him and gun-making out, the Quaker society was denying wider Quaker and even societal participation in an economic system that was based on war. He lost the debate. The yearly meeting was not persuaded by his arguments, and this disownment process proceeded. But despite the disownment, Galton sort of defiantly continued to attend the worship in the Bull Street Meeting House, and he participated in its philanthropic activities. Perhaps because of his standing in Birmingham, he was allowed to do this. And perhaps maybe because other friends in Birmingham recognized some of the truth in his arguments, whatever the London meeting judged. And meanwhile, as this controversy was unfolding, his gun profits really went through the roof just at that moment. And in 1804, he did pass the business on to his son, who was Samuel Galton, but his own money still remained in that partnership, so it's not like he had completely disengaged from it. Also in that year, 1804, the family launched a bank, And they did that in partnership with Joseph Gibbons, who was another Quaker and who was also one of those three friends involved in the process of reclaiming and disowning Galton II. So clearly Gibbons had no problem working with this man despite having taken that morally condescending position of reclaiming him. So Samuel Tertius then was a banker and a gun contractor from 1804 to 1815, and it was in 1815 that the Galton gun business was finally wound up, and that final closure was the result of the collapse of state demand at the end of the wars, not because he had a moral dilemma about what he was doing. And that's partly because by then Tertius had left the Quaker fold. He married outside of it. He married Violetta Darwin, the daughter of Erasmus Darwin, and his son was Francis Galton, the father of eugenics. And there's a sort of interesting story to think about there. Now in 1831, the Galton Bank merged with what became Midland Bank, which was my bank in the 1990s when I lived in London. And when Galton II died in 1832, he was worth £300,000. So very, very wealthy. He was the wealthiest member of the Lunar Society. I think we can read Galton II's failure to win over the Society of Friends, with his arguments in 1795 and 96 as a key moment in which war-driven industrial capitalism was normalized by its critics' focus on particular scandals like the slave trade or the arms trade, by insisting on the particular perniciousness of his trade, gun making, and evading the questions he was trying to raise about wider collective complicity. The Quaker society became blind to the reality that the modern life emerging around them was, to a very significant extent, founded on militarism. So Midland Bank, which is now part of HSBC, that happened in the 1990s. If we know that Midland Bank was founded on the wealth of the gun trade, that's interesting, but sort of an interesting piece of trivia. But I think it's more provocative to think about the fact that in some measure, the fortunes that went into the banks founded by Galton's relatives, the Lloyds and the Barclays, who were in various kind of more oblique ways, also involved in the gun business as merchants and in war business generally, as bankers, as ironmongers, as merchants. Those banks are also founded on this same gun business or related to that gun business. It's a much wider impact than just Midland itself. But in 1795, the scandal was Galton's arms-making manufacturing, not the Midland economy's general dependence on government contracts or other Quakers' investment in war. And so by criticizing gun manufacturing, the Society of Friends avoided having to criticize war and conquest and other forms of participation in it. And I think this has really remained our way of dealing critically with industrial capitalism. We focus on the problem of particular bad commodities like drugs or slaves or arms that seem to implicate only a few. And in the 19th century, of course, Marx tried to reopen the question of systemic wrong, right? And then we had Henry David Thoreau with advocating tax resistance as another way of recognizing that this is a much wider phenomenon. But the targeted tactic of consumer boycott, boycotting these bad goods, has, I think, endured much better than systemic critiques that require much more, what shall we say, revolutionary action. And I think that's testimony to the success of industrial capitalism's mode of self-critique and normalization. So to conclude, I've tried to resurrect Galton Jr.'s critique of the wholesale dependence of industrial capitalist life on warfare, not so much because I want to exonerate him or vindicate him, but more to implicate us, right, as he was trying to do with his fellow Quakers. In the 18th century military-industrial society that he described lay the origins of Britain's emergence as a global superpower and a cautionary tale about the place of violence in modern industrial and commercial life. A place where it was so central and yet so hidden that even a sincere Quaker might have easily participated in its propagation while maintaining a truly clear conscience. Thank you so much for listening.